Our concluding speaker was born, raised, and educated in Salt Lake City, Utah. In 1964, and in that same city, he attended his first JBS meetings, one of which was a speech delivered by Robert Welch to a gathering of over 2,000 people, an experience that changed his life. In 1972, our speaker gave up his business career to accept the responsibilities of a full-time coordinator with the John Birch Society, an assignment he diligently filled for 13 years. In 1991, after serving as both a major coordinator and the Society's director of field activities, he was asked to take his present position at the helm of the Society as its chief executive officer. Our speaker and his wife Elaine, parents of a large family, reside in Menasha, Wisconsin, near to our JBS headquarters. Having worked with Vance Smith since the middle 1980s, I think I know what makes him a great CEO for the John Birch Society. It's his unparalleled drive and determination to make the John Birch Society become what Robert Welch envisioned it as a force to change the course of history. His extensive field experience, in particular, make his counsel invaluable as we map out programs, because the field is where the action is, and that's where victory must be won. It's an honor to introduce G. Vance Smith, speaking on the topic of marshaling our layers of strength. Please welcome G. Vance Smith.
Thank you, Tom. It is truly a privilege and honor to be here this evening with you in Boise, Idaho. Wish to express our appreciation to you for being here. We recognize that there's a lot of travel involved during the day. I've talked to people from Northern California, from Oregon and Washington, from Montana and Wyoming, and from Utah. And we have a number of people here that have traveled from our Robert Welch Club and from other parts of the country. Tremendous effort, and thank you. Thank you for being here. Wish to express appreciation to those locally that work so hard to make this work here. Our coordinator, local coordinator Dale Pierce, coordinator Chick Hylison, major coordinator Greg Smith, and many others. Thank you very much. Please, let's give them a round of applause. We meet 4 times a year with our executive committee of the Council of the John Birch Society. And at the 2 council functions and council dinners, we have all of our council here. At least those that can be here. A number have been excused for very good reasons. They always try to attend these meetings. But I'd like you to know how much we appreciate them, how much they do. A number of the men on the stand here have been on our council for many years, many of them appointed by Robert Welch himself as he led the organization. These men give valuable counsel as they work with us in this advisory capacity. We appreciate them, and we'd like you to recognize them as well here. Tonight, I'd like you to share with us for a few moments honoring a couple of individuals. We like to do that on these occasions, and tonight there are 2 men that we would really like to give special recognition to. One is one of those council members that has served for many, many years, he having been appointed by Robert Welch in 1976 to serve on the council, and was invited to serve on the executive committee in 1984. He's from Florida. He has been president of a bank, presently runs a real estate and development firm with his wife. A wonderful man, having given so much over the years of his tireless time and effort to this cause. And we'd like to recognize Walt Ruckel and present him with a plaque. Jack and Tom, would you come forward, please, like both of you? Walt Ruckel, please. We would also like to present his wife, Christine, with some flowers as a token of our appreciation for all that you do. Another man we wish to recognize this evening is a man familiar to many of you here in the Idaho area, and Boise in particular. A man that has been on our staff for over 20 years, served as a coordinator here in Idaho for 10 years, served on our staff both in San Marino and in Appleton and in Utah for those years, for 10 or 11 years. A man that we have learned to rely on a great deal because of his vast knowledge and understanding of the Constitution and his devotion to the Constitution and his tireless efforts to preserve it. Don Fotheringham has told us that this next February we'll embarrass him by telling you he'll turn 75. And he said the word retirement is not in his vocabulary, but he does wish to do some things that he's been waiting to get old enough to do. So we're just delighted, and we'd like to again share with you a moment as we give and make this presentation to Don, the same type of a plaque, and also flowers for his wife, Jean. Don Fotheringham, please. We work with some wonderful people. Robert Welch said years ago, so many, many times, that this is the finest body of men and women in the world. And recognizing the importance of this great fight for freedom, and having had the opportunity to associate with so many of them and of you, I hardly agree. This is a great fight, a great battle, and it's an honor to be a part of it. The very fact that we have been able to come together this evening in these beautiful surroundings is testimony to the abundant freedoms we still enjoy. And when you consider the many assaults made upon those freedoms by the insiders, it is truly only by the grace of God that we are still in possession of them. More precisely, the blessings of God and the American system He inspired with its many layers of strength. Most of you recall these often quoted words of Robert Welch at the founding meeting of the Society. Quote, "We do not have to be too late. We do not have to lose the fight. Communism has its weaknesses, and the communist conspiracy has its vulnerable points. We have many layers of strength not yet rotted by all of the infiltration and political sabotage to which we have been subjected." Unquote. And if anyone doubts that such layers of strength still exist in our society, that there are still a large number of decent, self-sacrificing, and patriotic Americans among us, he or she should merely have to look at the tremendous outpouring of support for America and for those affected by the terrorism that has swept across the nation since September 11th. It's been most encouraging, and I'm sure that you agree. We are concerned, though, because while the American people have been wrapping themselves around the American flag during these recent weeks, our leaders have not. They have been wrapping themselves with the United Nations flag. Let me add a caveat. The Americans responded with equal patriotic fervor following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Men enlisted in the military in droves, civilians endured rationing and contributed generously to war effort by collecting scrap metal and buying war bonds and donating to the Red Cross and USO. And after all the blood, sweat, and tears expended by good Americans to defeat tyranny and safeguard our freedoms, what happened? How did the Roosevelt-Truman administration manage the fruits of that Herculean effort? You know the answer. By abandoning Eastern Europe to the communists, by ensuring the communist takeover of mainland China, and finally, by leading the United States into the United Nations trap designed to engulf our nation in a socialist New World Order. The United Nations, supposedly instituted to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which, in retrospect, would be almost laughable if not for the tremendous loss of life in Korea, Vietnam, Katanga, Rwanda, and in other theaters of war managed by the UN Police Action, UN subsidiaries, CETO and NATO, and a variety of peacekeeping operations. And now, in the aftermath of the worst domestic terrorist attack in U.S. history, our leaders are looking to the United Nations to save us from terrorism. Heaven help us. Since the terrorist attacks of September 11th, we have seen a steady movement on the part of our political leaders to transfer much of our authority to wage the war on terrorism to the UN and UN agencies such as NATO. Let's look at how this game plan ties in with what one-worlder Lincoln P. Bloomfield wrote back in 1962 in a study entitled A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. The study was financed by both the State Department under CFR member Dean Rusk and by the Defense Department led by CFR member Robert S. McNamara. Bloomfield explained that the global regime he envisioned will occasionally be referred to unblushingly as a world government. He pointed out that the notion of world government was based on recent American policy. Yet, as CFR member Bloomfield acknowledged, it was questionable whether the American people and their elected representatives would accept such a radical transformation. As long as people have unswerving allegiance to their own nation, Bloomfield maintained, quote, the prospect is dim for consensus leading to formation of a universal community with a preponderance of power at the center, unquote. So he explored a way to bring about, quote, a sudden transformation in national attitudes, unquote. One scenario Bloomfield envisioned as sufficient to bring about such change is, quote, a crisis, a war, or a brink of war situation so grave or commonly menacing that deeply rooted attitudes and practices are sufficiently shaken to open the possibility of a revolution in world political arrangements, unquote. September 11th attacks and the earlier Oklahoma City bombing, among other incidents, seemed to be yet another, and not necessarily the last, of the series of sudden, nasty, and traumatic shocks Bloomfield hoped would be adequate to create a durable world order. The UN is the cornerstone of that new world order. It is also the world's largest assemblage of terrorists. If our political leaders had any shred of decency and honesty, they would be disassociating the United States with the United Nations as a result of the terrorist attacks, not inviting the United Nations to oversee the war on terrorism worldwide. As Bill Jasper said years ago, the United Nations should be called Terrorists Are Us. Scores of nations represented in the United Nations are dictatorships brought to power through terrorism. Just think of communist Cuba, Vietnam, Cambodia, Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, the current South African government, Namibia, Angola. The list goes on and on. In the weeks prior to the attack on our country, Secretary General Kofi Annan was in South Africa at a UN World Conference on Racism, which was actually nothing more than a pep rally for America's enemies. Our excellent writers in the New American have been documenting the subject of terrorism for years, long before the recent attacks on our homeland. Let's review just a few points made in the magazine in recent years regarding our partners at the United Nations, who supposedly will help us in the international effort against terrorism. First, let's start with China. Al Santoli, a special assistant to Republican Congressman Dana Rohrabacher of California, pointed out that, quote, Red China is an insurgent military power that perceives the United States as its chief adversary. They are building nuclear-armed missiles that will target American cities, and this, at that time, the Clinton administration, has given them the means to refine the accuracy of those missiles. They are exporting military technologies, including those used in nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, to Pakistan, Iran, Syria, and other anti-American terrorist regimes. And this administration refuses to impose sanctions, unquote. Another partner we have now, Russia. For 30 years, the Soviet KGB had been the premier trainer and supporter of terrorist organizations worldwide. And despite a name change and reformation, it remains fully active. Russian Foreign Minister Yevgeny Primakov, the former head of the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Service, is a noted Arabist and has close ties to Syria's recently deceased Hafez al-Assad. A Mid-East intelligence analyst explained to the New American that, quote, most of the recent, at that time, 1997, terrorist attacks have been either planned or facilitated in some way by Syrian military intelligence, unquote. Another partner, Iran. In April 1999, the State Department released its Patterns of Global Terrorism report, which designated Iran, along with Cuba, Iraq, Libya, North Korea, Sudan, and Syria, as a state sponsor of international terrorism. We could speak volumes about similar support of terrorism by UN member nations, but you get the idea. In 1998, Bill Jasper wrote, quote, we have no more hope of winning the war against terrorism than we have had in our failed war against drugs if we allow our leaders and policymakers to continue to subsidize, support, and treat as allies the principal state sponsors of terrorism. As long as the U.S. and other Western governments pretend not to see and understand the Russian and Chinese hands behind international terrorism and continue to pretend that Osama bin Laden, again, this is 3 years ago, October 1998, when Bill wrote this, Osama bin Laden, Taliban, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Hezbollah, the PLO, Libya, Iran, Syria, et al., are independent actors. We will see the victim corpses of terrorism pile higher and higher, unquote, Bill Jasper, 3 years ago. Look at the platform of that the United Nations provides to the likes of former South African President Nelson Mandela, PLO head Yasser Arafat, and others of their stripe. Though Mandela now poses as a respectable elder statesman from South Africa and is a welcome guest at UN conferences, a look at his background reveals otherwise. When brought to trial for his terrorist activities in 1964, Nelson Mandela admitted having written books on guerrilla warfare and military training and confirmed that he had planned sabotage. Documents in his own handwriting bearing the titles How to Be a Good Communist and Dialectical Materialism were placed in evidence. One of Mandela's fellow leaders of the terrorist African National Congress, and also an important member of the South Africa Communist Party, was Thabo Mbeki, now president of South Africa. Mbeki recently hosted the UN's World Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa. The conference was basically an American-bashing session, providing a platform for the likes of Yasser Arafat, Fidel Castro, on other leaders of similar despotisms. In the decades before the ANC came to dominate South Africa politically, the black revolutionaries of Mandela's ANC used a particularly gruesome necklace killing to intimidate fellow blacks. It called for placing a tire around the shackled victim's neck, filling the tire with gasoline, igniting it, and watching the poor wretch die a horrible death. Yet Winnie Mandela, Nelson Mandela's wife, told her ANC followers, quote, "With our boxes of matches and our necklaces, we shall liberate this country." But we don't have to go into the past to find evidence of the UN providing a cozy home for terrorist regimes, or for the United States passively acquiescing to such hypocrisy. By now, many of you have read the latest insult to free nations, which occurred when at UN headquarters, the October 8th election of Syria to the Security Council. As William Jasper wrote about the regime of the late Assad, quote, "The totalitarian dictatorship has been for many years one of the most dangerous villains on the U.S. State Department's list of nations engaged in state-sponsored terrorism," unquote. A new member of the United Nations Security Council, which our president and this administration have sided up with to fight terrorism. It's complete madness. Our government's partnership with the UN and Syria in response to terrorism will continue to provide us with ever more opportunities to make our Get Us Out campaign relevant to events in the news. I think you would agree that the recent terrorist attacks fit perfectly Bloomfield's scenario for, quote, "a crisis, a war, or a brink of war situation so grave or commonly menacing that deeply rooted attitudes and practices are sufficiently shaken to open the possibility of a revolution in world political arrangements," unquote. And who would have the resources to create such a crisis? A Bin Laden? An Arafat? A Castro? A Mandela? How about a combination of all of these and others less well known, pooling their resources through a worldwide network of underground operatives? In his October 2nd address to the General Assembly, Secretary of General Kofi Annan stated, quote, "In this struggle, there is simply no alternative to international cooperation. Terrorism will be defeated if the international community summons the will to unite in a broad coalition, or it will not be defeated at all. The United Nations is uniquely positioned to serve as the forum for this coalition," unquote. Kofi Annan knows that he can stop the bloodshed of terrorism with the United Nations because the terrorists are so well represented therein. It's reminiscent of Hitler's brown shirts. The people of Germany elected Hitler to stop the revolution and the terrorism in the streets because they knew their elected leader could stop the terrorism and stop the brown shirts because they knew he controlled them. Even more alarming, however, are statements emanating from the highest levels of our government that suggest an official U.S. recognition of the UN as the ultimate authority determining the extent of U.S. policies. Washington Times columnist Nicholas Kralev reported on September 26 about a statement made by Secretary of State Colin Powell. Powell at first stated that, quote, "President Bush retains the authority to take whatever action he believes are appropriate in accordance with the needs for self-defense of the United States and of the American people," unquote. But according to Kralev's report, our Secretary of State then went on to assert that Article 51 of the UN Charter gives member states the right to self-defense. That's incredible. It's bad enough that our leaders go to the UN for the authority to take action. But here we have the claim that the UN, and not God, grants the civilians of the world their rights. Secretary Powell apparently agrees that our nation's national right of self-defense, a right that by definition is synonymous with national sovereignty, has been granted by the United Nations. as serious as our government's rush towards world government is, the move to federalize all domestic security is equally alarming. We now have the Office of Homeland Security, which will coordinate all aspects of Homeland Security under one person. Former Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge was sworn in as the cabinet-level head of the new office on October 8th. This office was first proposed by the U.S. Commission on National Security, 21st Century, created in 1998 through the initiative of President Clinton and Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich. It is quite easy to see that the insiders do not have to scramble to come up with a game plan after every crisis in order to exploit the crisis to take it to its advantage. Their plans having already been made, the insiders sit like vultures, waiting for the next installment of a series of sudden, nasty, and traumatic shocks, ready to pounce and feed off the victims. So what's the solution? And where must we concentrate our efforts? In preventing the erosion of our Constitution and freedom at home, or in preventing the dismantling of the U.S. sovereignty and the buildup of the New World Order under the United Nations? I'll address the second option first, because the solution to both areas of concern is the same. We cannot choose between defending our nation against threats from within or threats from without. There's not one foreign problem and another domestic problem. There's a singular problem of exposing a conspiracy that recognizes no national borders. And the solution to that problem is right here in this room. You, ladies and gentlemen, are the solution. Not you alone, but tens of thousands more like you across America, and tens of thousands more that we must bring into this battle if we are to stop this conspiracy before our ability to do so as free men and women is taken from us. The terrorist attacks were made by one tentacle of the conspiracy octopus. To revive one of Robert Welch's often used analogies, the John Birch Society's strategy never has been to saw off tentacles, but to direct a harpoon right into the brain of the monster. Fortunately, we are fully prepared and ready to counter a threat even greater than Osama bin Laden. That threat is the surrender of our freedom to an international New World Order. And that's a point we must make clear to everyone who will listen. The response initiated by our leaders in Washington is not directed at the ultimate source of terrorism, but a lower-level terrorist agents. Our young men and women are not being asked to risk their lives to defend America, but rather, whether we like it or not, to promote the New World Order. So when you go back to your homes and meet with your fellow Birchers, I urge you to get behind the Get Us Out campaign. Review the strategy that Tom Gow and others have outlined for you in the October Bulletin, and take a good look at the wonderful new tools that our talented staff members have produced. These new tools will make your efforts so much more effective than they have been in the past. But don't try to do the job by yourselves. It's simply too large an undertaking. Recruiting more patriots into our ranks to multiply our efforts is a critical part of this campaign and will determine whether or not we will succeed. Ask your coordinator how you can help start a Get Us Out committee. It is the best way to bring new prospects into the battle to ensure truly concerted effort. I can't think of a better solution. I can't think of a better solution to the challenge that we face today. Can you? We want to thank you in advance for your willingness to be involved, to help in this undertaking. We all understand, those that are members of the John Birch Society and have been for a number of years, that what it takes is individuals, individually committed to this battle. Patriots who have that true spark of freedom and patriotism in their hearts that will really respond. Not everyone we'll do that. There's a calling process. We know that. Sometimes we have to talk to 10 or 100, maybe several hundred, to find the 1, 2, or 3 truly great patriots that will catch the vision and work in this battle. But how hard have we been looking for them? How committed have we been to that process? What's standing in the way of the success of the John Birch Society envisioned by Robert Welch is just that we have too few pullers at the oars. We have too few that are committed to hold meetings, to be chapter leaders, to be section leaders, to be get us out campaign committee chairmen. We have too few. They're out there. They really are. Bill Jasper's book, Will Grigg's book, the tools that have been mentioned, the recent UN issue of the magazine, these outreach tools will find those individuals. But it's up to you and to me to get those tools in the hands of those individuals. Again, I'd like to thank each of you for being here. I'd like to thank each of you that have been in the trenches for so many years. I'd like to thank each of you personally for all that you've done. But now, right now, is the most important time in our history that we can be doing what we're doing. Now is the time when the insiders are moving to that anticipated time when their works for a new world government would cease to be conspiratorial machinations behind the scenes and would become open and blatant call by them for a new world order. Now is that time. There have been a great number of people influenced by you and other members of the Birch Society over the years. We must reach back to them. We must find new people. And while there is time, we must do everything in our power to ensure Robert Welch's dream of less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. Thank you very much.